board workshop agenda.
All right, Dr. Aguilar, if we can pull the insurance fund matter and defer it to a future budget meeting, please.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. First item on the agenda is 2.1, review of the budget recap and timeline.
Okay, the current timeline reflects the meeting that we're currently engaged in, where we begin our discussions of the general fund and proceed to a meeting on May 16th, May 11th, which is Thursday, where we would continue any discussions regarding the general fund that we don't finish up, if we don't finish up today, and that could be the time that we bring up the group insurance fund, since that one has been deferred. From there, we go to Tuesday of next week, May 16th, where we bring all funds back, those that we reviewed in February, all the way through current date. And at that point, we would ask the board to authorize us to proceed with the adoption process, which would begin with public advertisement on May 24th, 25th, public inspection period May 24th through June 14th, with the public hearing scheduled tentatively for June 14th at 4, followed by a special board meeting to adopt at 4:30. One of the things I did want to mention is the purpose of the special board meeting is when we're presenting proposed budgets, especially when they're in the case where there's two scenarios, typically our goal is to leave the meeting with some direction from the board as to which scenario, if either, we should move forward with, and what modifications the board would like to see to those scenarios. In the past, when we've done it in budget workshops, since there's no official motion made, there were some occasions where we put in some changes requested by one or two board members, but it really wasn't necessarily changes that the entire board wanted to see. So the purpose of it being a special board meeting is for us, not for the board to say move forward with this budget, as much as for the board to give us direction on which items they would like to see included or retained, those removed, and then we would come back at a subsequent meeting with those changes incorporated so that the board could take a look at it and hopefully authorize us to proceed. So that's the purpose of the special board meeting. It's only to give us the direction so that when we come back, we're giving the board what they're actually looking for in terms of modifications to the original proposed budget. I just wanted to clarify that. The intent is just to keep the process moving, I guess, with the clear idea of what direction the board wants us to head in.
Thank you, Mr. Guidry. I have no doubt that you will have adequate direction tonight. Okay, 2.3, the preliminary report for the 17-18 general fund budget summary, projected revenues and expenditures.
I'll just need a minute to get to that. In the case of the general fund budget summary, summary is meant to, in an abbreviated fashion, present a proposed general fund budget for the 17-18 school year. And in this case, we've presented two scenarios. They're very similar. Scenario 2 basically begins where scenario 1 leaves off. So I thought we could begin by reviewing scenario 1, and then at that point simply review the changes or the additions that in scenario 2 incorporates that are not reflected in scenario 1, and then ask the board for some direction with regards to what portions of scenario 1 or 2 or a combination of both they'd like to see us move forward with. So with that said, I'd like to just briefly go over the format of the document that we're going to be reviewing. The general fund budget summary, the first section is that of fund balance. This is the fund balance that it was presented in our audited financial results for fiscal year 16. From there, we go into revenues, where we break it down by local, state, and federal revenues, and we'll review the assumptions that we used in arriving at the proposed budgeted revenues for 17-18. The third section, beyond revenues, are amounts to be allocated to cost centers in schools. These items were not included in the cost centers. There are a limited number of them compared to last year. Last year, a request was made to run or to process as many as the cost center changes as we could through the cost centers. So we did that this year, but there are a few line items that we would look to board direction for, because some of them can run through several cost centers. So if we were to put it in and then have to take it out, it becomes quite a task to get that done. And a few of them are on the listing because the request came in after we had finalized the cost centers, and we just needed a place to put them. So that section there are amounts that would be allocated to cost centers if they're approved by the board. The section following that are basically all of the cost centers. We begin with what we call the roll forward budget, which is the budget that we took a snapshot on the day that we began the budget process. I believe the date was January 27th. To that, we make baseline budget adjustments to get to the adjusted baseline. Now, baseline budget adjustments reflect the current staffing that existed at the time that we did the roll forward. So, for example, our roll forward budget reflected the staffing the last time we rolled the budget forward in the previous year. So it needs to be updated. So we run those changes through. We also run through the baseline adjustments, the increase to the retirement contribution by the board as mandated or required by our retirement systems at the state level. These rates are determined and passed down and communicated to the school districts and expected to be funded. So that's in there as well. It also includes a 3% group health, the board share of a 3% group health premium increase. So there's an example of something that may change once we have further discussions. But in order for it to run through the cost centers, we utilize the automated features of our salary simulation to basically calculate the increase and distribute it to the cost centers instead of having to do that manually, because the manual process is pretty extensive, labor intensive. So those are the major items that are included in the baseline budget adjustments and arriving at adjusted baseline. Then you'll notice transfers, and that's just if a cost center supervisor wants to transfer budget from one line item in their budget to another, they would include it here with an explanation as to why that transfer is needed. Proposed increases and decreases. These are the increases and decreases that our cost center supervisors are requesting. You will see those in the section 4, which is where our cost centers begin, and every one of them are listed individually with explanations for the proposed changes. So sum all of those up together and you come up to the proposed budget. There's a column for administrative or workshop adjustments. There are none in the column at this point. So in essence, the proposed budget in the last column is the same as that in the third to last column. So those are sort of the sections. Those are all of the sections of this particular general fund budget summary. So what I'd like to do at this point is begin with the revenue section and briefly touch on the highlights in terms of some of the material changes that are reflected or being proposed in the proposed increase column. Ask if there are any questions before we move on to the expenditures. So with that said, on page 1 of the general fund budget summary, immediately following the fund balance section, our revenue sections begin. Under local revenue, we have sales taxes, both the 66 and the 88 sales tax. You'll notice, or I would ask for you to notice or note, that in the proposed increase column, you'll notice for sales tax revenue, which is the 66 tax, a proposed increase of $2,955,357. That amount, as denoted in the footnote section that's included with the general fund budget summary, reflects a 2.5% increase over and above our actual projected collections for the current year. So let me define actual projected collections for the current year very briefly. We took the actual collections through December, because at the time we started the process, that's where we were. December was the last month at that time that we had actual collections. And then we used what had been budgeted for the current year for the remaining months. Given the fact that our actual collections are about 1% down from last year, and our budget, we had budgeted for a 7% decrease, that would strongly indicate that for those months that we used the budget, which was January through June, it was pretty hopefully a conservative estimates, because those reflected a 7% decrease when we're actually experiencing a 1% decrease. We, again, took the actual from July to December, added the budgeted from February to June. That gave us the revenue base to which we increased 2.5% for the current year. And that's how we arrived at the $2,955,000 for the 66 tax, which is the first sales tax line item. And that's also the same calculation we made, or same process that was used for the 1988 sales tax, which resulted in a $1,255,936 increase. Any questions with regards to sales tax before we move on to property tax? As I mentioned, it'll go pretty quickly because there's only about 4 line items that have any substantive change. These are two of them.
Mr. Guidry, I want to make sure I understand correctly. So we budgeted a 7% decrease for fiscal year 17, and then we are using the actual collections for half the year, which we anticipated or which we measured to be a 1% decrease, and then we are going to project a 2.5% increase from the 1% decrease.
Well,
am I getting that correct?
For
instance, so let's say the 42,866,024. That is an annual collection on the 65 sales tax with a 1% decrease from fiscal year 16, right?
Actually, because we have not adjusted our original adopted budget, this is actually the amount with the 7% decrease in it.
So 42,866 is the 7% decrease
for the full year.
And so what we're actually, to put it in the we're going to project a 4.5% decrease from 2 years ago. That's what this number means right here. Am I thinking about it?
It's close. Let's just put that on hold just for a minute.
Okay.
And take a look at how we arrived at the base to increase by 2.5%. The first 6 months, we utilized or inputted actual collections. So in essence, that removed 6% because our actual collections were actually just 1%. And then for February through June, we used budgeted, which had the 7% in it. So we have the budgeted number, which is our baseline, which is from the previous year. We have an actual projected number, which is what we're actually using as our base to apply the 2.5% to.
Okay.
It's
That's where I missed it, was the actual plus the second half of the fiscal year. That number is actually not
Yes.
on here. Okay.
Yes, that's
All right.
correct.
Thank you very much.
We'll move on to property taxes if there are no other questions. Property taxes, we projected a 2% increase. Shared our calculations or our projected increase with the tax assessor, and he indicated that he felt it was a good conservative estimate for property taxes. Interest income, we ran into a similar situation in the sales tax, and I'm not going to put you all through that discussion again, but the $700,000 that we're proposing is actually a slight decrease from what our actual projected income, interest income will be. We're projecting it to be about $730,000, but the number, our starting point or our baseline budget is the budgeted number that was calculated last year before the year even started. So even though we're reflecting a $100,000 increase because we're trying to get the roll forward budget from last year when we were preparing for this year to what we're projecting for next year, it is a slight decrease from our actual projected for fiscal year 17. For the same reason we discussed for sales tax. When we're looking at interest income, we look at what our actual projected is, and that's how we basically project for next year. But when we're determining the adjustment that's required, we're comparing that number that's calculated to the budgeted number, which is a roll forward number from basically 2 years prior, because it runs through the same process. But good news is it's a slight increase over what we had budgeted for the current year to the tune of $100,000. I'm going to, unless there are any questions, move forward to other revenue, because we have slight adjustments here and there for some of the other local line items. I'm sorry. So with that said, I would ask if there are any questions relating to any line items under local revenues before I proceed to state revenues.
And I would like to encourage any members of the public who have questions or comments on this portion to speak now. All right, Mr. Guidry.
Okay, the first line item under state revenue that shows a material increase is that of MFP, Minimum Foundation Program, which is our state funding. And you'll see or note an $8 million increase there. And there are two main reasons for the increase. One is the calculation itself in terms of how the state share of the funding is calculated versus the local share. The sales tax calculation, there's two pieces to it. One is they take a look at our sales tax property base. The other is they take a look at our property tax base, but from 2 years ago. Those numbers are 2 years in arrears. So 2 years ago is when we had a pretty significant drop in our sales tax revenues, if you'll recall. So in that regard, it generated about a $4 million, maybe even a little bit more, probably closer to $5 million increase as it ran through the calculation, because that sales tax base impacts the level 1, and again in level 2 it comes in, and it generated more state revenues at both levels because it indicated, since our revenue base had gone down, we needed more help. We needed the state to pick up a bigger share of the funding. And so for this 1 year, it benefits us considerably. Because of that delay in the year that they actually take a look at, it really becomes a challenge, because more times than not, when it's 2 years in arrears, we were experiencing an increase in sales tax collections 2 years ago, experiencing a decrease in the current year, and so the state funding would go down because it was based on revenues from 2 years ago. So we get hit there, and we get hit again locally because our sales tax collections would go down. For the first year in quite a while, it's actually the other way, where our sales tax collections are on the rebound somewhat, and 2 years ago our sales tax collections had dropped significantly. So we're getting that increase there. The other item, a line item that contributed significantly to this $8 million increase, the other $3 million in the calculation roughly, is those students who are weighted in determining the student count. That's multiplied by the $3,961 that the state funds per student. More specifically, your career and technical students, your gifted and talented students, students with disabilities. We had an increase of, I believe it was about 1,600 weighted units. A good bit of it due to our career and tech program with that new diploma track. Joe, what Jumpstart, is that?
Jumpstart diploma.
Yes. So that generated an increase in the weighted number of students that gets added to our actual students. The idea of being in weighting, the idea is the state recognizes that it costs a little bit more to educate a student with a disability, or to offer additional programs for the gifted and talented, or to offer the programs required for career and tech, be it a Jumpstart diploma or any of the other certifications. So they may count the student, instead of counting it as one. I know for disabilities, I believe they count it as 1.5. So it actually increases your actual population to student population to a larger number that's then multiplied times the 3,961. That's the other $3 million. So I just wanted to explain the $8 million. I think it's important to have a general understanding of it, because it's not something that's going to be recurring. Next year we're going to start seeing the sales tax that's coming in. Yes, it's still going to be from 2 years ago, but it's going to show a slight uptick in our collection, and it's going to decrease at $5 million that we're expecting in 17-18. It's going to bring it down some. So I'm excited for the year that we have it, and we'll deal with subsequent years when they come about. But that's the main increase for MFP. And one of the things that I ask you to note is this is a net figure. JCFA is the new charter school that they approved, and that number is, in essence, the calculation has backed out the funds that will be the state funds that will be allocated to JCFA. So this number is net after those numbers have been removed. But I did want to make a note of it that it is reflected, because there's no other way to see it other than to footnote it in the numbers. With regards to the state revenues, that's pretty much it in terms of any significant changes. Any questions with regards to state revenues before I go into federal? Federal revenues, there's not much of a change. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Guidry, sorry.
I don't have a question on the topic or the presentation, but I do want to make a comment and thank Madam President for allowing input from the public. I had constituents that were concerned that this is a special meeting and that we could approve all of these items tonight with one motion and a second and 5 votes. And the only time, and I think it's right, that discussion should take place is on a motion, which is Robert's rules, and I think it's a efficient way to run a meeting. However, I think that probably this is one of the most important things that we do on the school board. I think choosing a superintendent and passing a budget are probably 2 of the most important things that we do. And I just want to thank you for allowing input, even though there wasn't a motion on the floor, that you allow the public to have input, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. You were here a few minutes late, so we are running it as a workshop, so that we are asking for input. And so at this point, if there's any public comment on the state revenue section. All right. Mr. Guidry.
The federal revenue section, I'll mention only that it's a slight increase of $24,900. And by slight, I mean in comparison to the total budget. And that reflects the program at Como High basically being eligible for reimbursement again. I think they had a probationary period the year before, so now we're seeing the reimbursements come in, and that's why we're showing an increase there. In other revenues, there's a decrease of $1,435,656. That decrease reflects removing the one-time transfer that was in the current year budget for the 16-17. Keep in mind, we take a snapshot of the current year budget. The day that we take that snapshot, whatever's in that account is what is our starting point. So in essence, our 16-17 budget, more cases than not, are our starting point. Well, in that amount, you may recall we had a $1.5 million one-time transfer to the general fund to balance the budget. So this in essence is taking that figure out. There are some other numbers running through this account, so it's not quite 1.5 million, but the majority of that adjustment is removing that 1.5 million out of the general fund, since it was a one-time transfer. The indirect cost, 115,000 increase. That's basically just to get the proposed 17-18 budget to what we actually collected in 16-17. We're expecting that number to be even higher, but until we actually get the grant awards, we want to take a conservative approach to calculating the revenues. And that basically takes us through the revenue section. Before we go into expenditures, I'd ask one more time if there were any questions regarding any of the revenue sections we reviewed up to this point.
Mr. Hidalgo.
Yes. That might be the key word. We've reviewed up to this point. It says here, total revenues. 263,445,002. I'm taking that to mean that is our that's the total amount of revenues that we are budgeting.
That 263 figure that you're asking about is our, what we call our roll forward or baseline budget. In other words, that on 127, when we took this snapshot of what was going to be our starting point, 127 of this year, that's the total of the budget that were in place for 16-17. To that, we add our proposed increases and decreases to arrive at the proposed 17-18 budget of 278,061,667. So that's actually the proposed budget. It's the 278,061,667.
278,061,667.
Correct.
Total budget.
Correct. For general fund.
Great. Right. So may I? So board workshop. So I guess I could address what I'd like to ask is, in light of that information, I'd like to ask is Michael Lunsford, Carol Ross, or Mr. Chris Como present with us this evening? I didn't think so. Thank you, Madam President.
All right. And do any other members of the public have any comments at this time? All right. Thank you, Mr. Guidry.
Okay, the next section deals with those proposed changes that have not been run through the cost centers and will be run through the cost centers if and when they're approved by the board. So I'll go through each one of them line item by line item, and once I get to the end, I'll ask if there are any questions, because there aren't a significant number, because as I mentioned, we ran most of them through the cost centers. The first line item is a standard one. It's contingency, standard budget amount, $100,000. On a $278 million budget, we have typically from year to year budgeted this $100,000 contingency to allow the superintendent some flexibility on if there's an item that there's some additional funding that's needed for, that's required, we don't have to come back to the board for, for minimal amounts. Typically, these are things, day-to-day things that we're trying not to slow down, day-to-day operations for some pretty minute differences. So that's what the $100,000 is about, and we've had it in the budget, I think, for quite some time now. But we list it separately to give the board the option to reconsider. Tuition increased, early college academy, $267,100. That is not, in my opinion, optional. I mean, that is what it would take to continue that program. A number was higher before we started our negotiations. I think Dr. Aguilar, Ms. Samick, Mr. Craig, as well as Principal Castillo did a remarkable job at lowering that number after discussions. It wasn't necessarily, it was negotiations, but it was negotiations with explanations and with supplied logic. They were all justifiable. So just wanted to make mention of that, because that took some effort there. That number was a bit higher when we first started. Transportation route savings, $1.6 million. That reflects a projected reduction in the number of routes due to the rezoning, rerouting, and it also reflects a reduction in operational allowance of $600,000. That's the operational reimbursement that we pay to contract drivers. Over the year, we've had retirements. So as those contract bus drivers retire, they're typically are replaced with board drivers who are driving board-owned buses. So there's a net savings, if you will, what that's reflected here. we took the operational reimbursement or operational allowance that we thought tied to the retirements and reduced it by the increase in fuel we knew was going to occur because we were going to have to provide board-owned buses to replace those contract buses. Netted the two and came up with the $600,000. So that is actually $1,600,000 reduction. We got a late request, and
Mr.
by late
Gidry?
I mean after.
Excuse
Any
me.
questions?
Yeah, Ms. Morrison had a question.
ECA, can you share the savings in regards to negotiation, where we were, where we are now, and do we have that information?
I'm going to go back, and I'm thinking that it would probably be an equal amount, Annette. It was.
So my recollection, it was about
Okay.
roughly, remember, this was just a preliminary discussion, about $440,000. That was subsequently reduced to the figure $267,000. So we worked closely with Dr. Harder and her team and really found a way to be more cost-effective in the tuition.
Thank you.
The furniture for Thibodeau STEM, when that renovation was taking place, and we basically, for the most part, completed that project, there were a few concerns by the principal that it's like, well, you know, the extra the funds that we didn't utilize are getting transferred. What if there's something, you know, that's needed to completely finish it? And that's what this amount represents. And it's far less than the amount of excess funds that were moved and used for other purposes. The request was received after the cost centers budgets had been finalized, so that's why we're putting it in this section. The Act 1 lawsuit is the lawsuit concerning our former administrator, former superintendent. We placed the amount here that we thought, in the event that the courts rule in his favor, we placed the amount of the projected payout, contract purchase, if that's the way we'll end up going, if that's the end result. We wanted to have those funds available. So that's what that line item represents.
Ms. Morris, could we maybe just have back up to the discussion about transportation savings, those reduction in the 20 routes? Mr. Craig and the Transportation Department are working on reducing the number of schools of choice routes. We're recommending and proposing and developing a satellite pickup situation to really reduce the cost of transportation to schools of choice. Mr. Craig, did you want to add something more to that?
Really, we already do schools of choice satellite stops, but in order to reach that target of 20, we would significantly cut back on those satellite options around the parish.
The next line item is additional positions outside of teaching staffing ratio. These specific positions were listed on an attachment, Schedule 2. I would mention that the first 3 positions, that of social worker, psychologist, and educational diagnostician, are required from a pupil appraisal standpoint. There's a staffing ratio required in our one of the state bulletins. And that gets us closer to that staffing ratio. This is one team, basically. We also have a LPN for the Telemed Health Center. We have a Spanish teacher to be shared by East Early College Academy and Paul Bro. We have an instructional strategist for David Thibodeau STEM. We have a pre-K teacher and para for French immersion at Myrtle Place, Evangeline, and Prairie. and that's what represents the 682,000 presented for this line item. The next line item is that of staff reclassifications. This is something where we get requests throughout the year for reclassifications of pay grade for positions. I believe it's been 2+ years since we've actually presented a recommendation, with the exception of one. I believe we made a presentation. It might have been in the current year where one position was approved. So they've been accumulating. They were much more significant than what's on this listing, but we provided a listing on Schedule 3 of those positions that the reclassification committee recommended to the superintendent. Superintendent reviewed and agreed to allow it to be presented with and included in the proposed budget. The total cost for salary and benefits for the general fund is the $66,005 that's reflected for that line item. There's also an additional cost that would be paid by various grant funds or capital funds, and that amount is $58,208. And that is what that line item refers to. Next line item deals with regular ed staffing with regards to teachers. In the staffing allocation booklet, there are certain staffing ratios, student-teacher ratios, that the board has approved. And when we apply those ratios, it determines if it's 24-1 or 26-1 or whatever the case may be, the number of teaching slots that grade level is entitled to for that school. But going beyond that, as enrollment firms up, as we get closer to the beginning of the start of the school year, we have changes in populations. We have students enrolling, we have students transferring, and so the current allocation indicates that before we add a teacher to that calculation that we did initially, using the board-approved student-teacher ratios, it would take an additional 2 students per class, and then one more beyond that before the next teaching slot would get allotted. This particular change would reduce that 2 to a 1. So what that means is the calculation would be completed based on the existing student-teacher ratios, and the next teaching slot over and above that, as the student population change or have the potential to change before a school year starts and even through the first 2 weeks, instead of adding a teacher once there's 2 teachers, 2 more students per class and 1 more before that extra teacher is allotted, we'd add 1 per section plus 1 before awarding that additional slot. So it actually awards that additional slot sooner. And so that, yes.
Mr. Guidry, it was 1 plus 1, and then we changed it last year to 2 plus 1.
And we're looking to,
So we're changing it back?
if approved, it would change it back.
Okay, that's the give, what's the take? Or that's the take, what's the give? Because last year we did it, it didn't directly increase pupil-teacher ratio, but
Mr. Hidalgo, so last year, well, first of all, in the budget last year, we had some 40 appeal teachers in the budget last year. At the beginning of the year, we had far too many instances where almost immediately a school needed an additional teacher. So we were just burning through the appeal teachers. We should have been staffing those schools adequately from the very beginning to hire the best teachers rather than late assignments. So I've asked HR to staff the schools appropriately so that we anticipate the additional students. If they're very, very close to the threshold, they are given that teacher in the preliminary allocation. So we're reducing the number of appeal slots down to 15 so that we don't have these late hires in August and September.
Thank you.
Dr. Aguilar, since we're going from 40 to 15, wouldn't the additional 25 teachers, that wouldn't cover the going from +2 to +1? Because I don't see any decrease in here for the additional 20. We granted all 40 appeal slots this year, right? We did. So do we have anywhere in here where the 25 teachers are recorded as a decrease in expenditures to offset? I mean, I would imagine that this 1.3 million, if we divide that by, how many teachers is that, Mr. Guidry? I can't divide that by 67,000 off the top of my head. That's 20?
20.
So 1.3 million is an increase of 20 teachers. I don't see a decrease of 5 from the appeals from last year. Am I overlooking that?
No. With regards to the staffing appeals, Mr. Craig, I know the staffing formula, when we took a look at it, there were some, I guess, very fine tweaks made to it as well in terms of, in order to recognize if for example, if there's a free period in there, that has to be allowed for. You can't just assume that that teacher's teaching all throughout the whole day. So one of the tweaks was to allow for that free period, which in essence creates additional teaching slots. And pretty much that, along with other such modifications, pretty much utilize those 40 appeal slots. So this is, in essence, would be an additional 20. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, sir. And the other challenge in staffing is at the middle schools. Because of the double blocking, we're really having a hard time getting an accurate number of teachers for those schools. And we've been playing with that factor for several years. This year, HR has granted either a band teacher or a music teacher, or I believe a French teacher, foreign language teacher, without counting it in the school's allocation, so that we can better staff those middle schools because of the double blocking that's going on in them.
So in essence, that last year's appeals have pretty much been absorbed by some of the things that we've just mentioned, and then in addition to that, we're looking at making the change of going from +2 to +1.
So where in this, where is that increase reflected? Those 20, I'm getting confused now. So the 25 teachers that we granted appeals for last year that are now being absorbed by the general fund, where is that increase from last year's approved budget?
It's in the baseline budget.
It's in the baseline budget.
Yeah. So that'll be it's in where our starting point.
Okay, so we're actually going to end up with 45 additional teachers plus 15 appeals over last year's adopted budget. Is that correct?
Actually, I would think it would be closer to 60, the 40 appeals from last year, the 20 here.
Which said the 20. Okay.
And then the 20 of going from +2 to +1, and then an additional 15 for potential 15, which would bring it to 75.
I will say it one more time that the staffing ratio, the ratio that we use to budget and decide how many teachers we hire is dumb. Just want to say that because I'm knee deep in this and I'm having a hard time follow. We should really just tell principals to tell us how many teachers you need. I'm done.
With regards to, that's regular ed. With regards to SPED, adjusting to the to the staffing formula would require an additional two teachers. I've already mentioned the staffing appeals of 15 teachers. That's $1,000,005. And then with regards to assistant principals, on one line, backing out 4 to adjust it to staffing ratio, and then adding them back as appeals, saying that we want to keep those 4 assistant principal slots. And that gets us through that point, the point of discussing the cost centers.
All right, is there any public comment on the section that we just went over? Hey, Mr. Angel?
I have a question on the appeals process and et cetera. Those teachers, are they, when we add teachers like that, are they teachers? I mean, are they classroom teachers, or do we call them teachers and there's something else?
Generally, Mr. Angel, that would be classroom teachers. Those would be because of unanticipated numbers in enrollment at a school by grade level.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure that that's what they were.
They're
And
largely, I mean, there might be an instance of somebody needs a paraprofessional rather than a teacher. We would take that out of the appeal slot, but largely it's for additional classroom teachers.
why. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, with regards to the cost centers, we list all of them. And as separate agenda items, we provided the details that support the totals that are reflected in the cost center section. So I'd like to, if it's okay with our board president, take a look at agenda item 2.4 and basically follow that and ask if there are any questions with regards to the 1100 series, meaning all cost centers in the range from 1101 to 1123 that are listed on the general fund budget summary. We reviewed the format so the board can see what increases are being incurred. If we go to the detail, those increases are detailed and explained as to why they're being requested. So at this point, I would ask for any questions the board may have, they may need clarification with regards to the detail. And we can take one cost center.
I'm picking a cost center at random is what I'm doing. So I don't want anybody to think I'm picking on them. So last year, the budget we adopted, Mr. Guidry, cost center 1203, maintenance, was $6,248,907.
Mr. Centeni,
Yes, sir.
since we're in the 1100s, can we pick one there? And
Oh, I thought I did. I'm sorry.
It might be easier if
Look at the top of the page, the 1100.
to pick one of the ones with the least amount of activity, so we can go through the explanation, and then from there.
Well, no, we don't even necessarily need to have the activity, right? Let's take 1111. Sorry, Ms. Bernard. Risk management. The adopted budget from fiscal year 17 was $354,088. And 1111 comes out the roll forward budget, and I'm not complaining about this. I just want to know how this works. It's $353,581. So that's a decrease of, if I can do my math real quick, $600. Yeah, 506. So, can you explain to me how we got from the adopted budget for cost center 1111 to the roll forward budget that is $500 less?
Yes,
And I'm not saying like tell me exactly what happened in that cost center to tell me what happened. It just there are several like that where the numbers don't
Yes.
agree. I just want to
And-
know what the methodology was.
Sure. The adopted budget was the adopted budget for 16, 17. To that's our starting point. The budget adjustments column are budget transfers that have been made through the date that we took that snapshot on 127. And this is something that dates back to what a board member request, where they wanted to see what kind of movement there was between accounts. And that gets us to our current budget. The budget as of, what was the date on that? Was it the same date? January 27th?
And I'll tell you what the number I just read for this cost center was. I just pulled it up off of our meeting website from the public hearing on the budget last June. So that's the number I referenced.
Which,
Was the starting number I referenced, right? So the 354.
okay, so
And
that's
$88.
That's the adopted budget. Then we record all of the transfers that occurred up until the time we took that snapshot, which was 127, to arrive at the current budget at that time. And then to that, we have a column referred to as baseline adjustments. What that reflects or incorporates several things. One thing that it incorporates is, keep in mind, for those cost centers that have individuals in them in terms of salaries, the adopted budget was based on staffing from March of 2016. So that has to be revised and reflect staffing as of March of 2017. So you're seeing some of the adjustments you're seeing there. You're also seeing the increase to our retirement rate for both LTRS and LSERS. Well, all retirement systems, those are the two main ones. You're seeing those running through as baseline adjustments as well. And the group health insurance increase was reflected in that column as well, the 3%. So that basically, did I miss any, Ms. Reshorn? No. Oh, one other thing. If you recall, the board approved a salary increase for support personnel in January of 2017. It was a prorated amount from February through June. Well, for those individuals in this cost center, we adjusted the budget to reflect a full year of that increase, because we're going to need to have a full year's worth of funding in 17 and 18. So that is the other adjustment. If I'm not mistaken, that represents all of the baseline adjustments or types of items that would be in the baseline adjustments, budget adjustments column, to allow us to arrive to our adjusted baseline. And that is our true starting point, to which we add requested increases and decreases that are requested by our cost center supervisors.
One follow-up, please. To make sure I understand correctly, this particular cost center, and I swear, Ms. Bernard, I'm not picking on you. I'm just using that as an example. In this particular cost center, the entire budgeted amount except for $500 was spent by January 27th? Am I understanding that roll forward, or is that another instance of we took the cash flows out of that account as of January 27th and then projected them for the rest of the year to arrive at a starting number?
No, that $506 for the most part is the step increase that did not occur. Yeah. If you remember, the salaries were frozen for 16, 17. So that's what those budget adjustments are.
That's the decrease.
Wait, so the salaries that were frozen, the increase was in the budget, but then we Is that
Is that the increase or the net increase?
That was the step increases.
Yeah.
Take it out.
The step increase was in the budget, and we came back and had to remove it.
okay? Thank you.
So that hopefully clarifies how the schedule flows. We basically wanted the board to be able to see how we get to our baseline budget, and then from our baseline budget, which is our roll forward budget, that's the snapshot that we took in January, on January 27th, what adjustments we had to make to arrive to an adjusted baseline that could be the starting point for our budget process for 17-18. It's sort of lengthy, but it leaves a good audit trail to see how we got from one point to the next. So I don't, at this point, if there are no other questions, I'd like to start at 1101, or basically the 1100s, and ask if there are any other questions with regards to the 1100 series, which is agenda item 2.4.
All right, and is there any public comment on item 2.4, the 1100 series? Mr. Guidry, there appear to be no questions or comments, so.
Okay. Given that fact, I'd like to move to agenda item 2.5, general fund cost centers, proposed budgets for the 1200 series.
Mr. Centani?
You get an explanation on the $520,000 for energy management utilities? Is that LUS increasing the rates on us, or?
But basically south side.
Okay.
That's cool.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, public comment? Okay, Mr. Guidry?
Okay. Agenda item 2.6, general fund cost centers, proposed budgets for the 1300 series. Any questions with regards to the 1300 series?
Mr. Centani?
The baseline budget adjustment of $571,000 for transportation, certainly that's not in all retirement, is it?
Which cost center you're looking at?
1309.
The 571 in terms of the
Baseline budget
Baseline
adjustment,
adjustments?
yes.
adopted. Do we have a detail on that one? We'll take a quick look at that. If there are any others, and we'll come back to it if you don't mind.
Sure
Skip
thing.
it for the time being. We'll come right back to it.
Can I also hear about the $350,000 increase in computer services?
Yes. That is a particular module for JPAMs. Let me just flip to the detail real quickly. Yeah, I will in a minute. It's referred to as IO Educational Software. It's a database dashboard service, an additional feature of JPAMS for document archiving. Beyond that, I'll have to defer to Ms. Dickerson to provide more detail.
Is Ms. Dickerson in the audience?
No, sir, but if you don't mind, I have Wendy Baudouin here, and Wendy can speak to you directly about the function of IO education.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those items, all of those items that are accounted for in the insurance increase.
Hi, Wendy Baudouin. I work in the Accountability Research and Evaluation Department. IO Education is a data warehouse data analytics platform that we have piloted across 12 schools in the previous school year. This cost center would pay to have full implementation across the district. It is a platform that takes data from approximately 25 different data systems and data files that exist across the district that houses information about students and places them into one warehouse in real time, so that teachers, admins, and district level staff can get real-time data on their students by logging into one system instead of multiple systems across the district. It also includes in that cost center a assessment platform to generate district and teacher-based formative and summative assessments across the district. It's including an item bank, which is also part of that platform. I believe Ms. Samek has some materials, synopsis specific to this particular warehouse that we've piloted in the district that she's handing out to you guys. So I can answer any questions about it. If you have any. Sure.
Fortunately, I know a thing or two about software. So the $343,000 that was in this line item last year, that included the pilot program. How much did we pay for the pilot?
So the entire cost center, the 300,000+, is not entirely for this project.
I see it's egg gear and JPAMs and things like that. I'm just asking how much we paid for
the pilot was approximately $29,000.
Okay. And so this is for the full implementation of this pilot?
It's for the full implementation of the pilot with the addition of an assessment platform.
And is this $345,000 annually? Or is this $345,000
It is approximately $239,000 annually.
Annually?
Yes.
$239,000.
It's a student license.
So they license us on per student?
Yes. It includes a student license for an analytics platform, a student license for an assessment platform, and a student fee for an item bank for the assessment platform.
I see that we implemented a pilot in January at 3 high schools.
So we implemented the pilot in August for 9 schools, and then the vendor offered 3 additional high schools in January for free to add to the pilot, so high schools could get a feel for if the analytics platform worked for them.
Do we have any kind of feedback on utilization rates by teachers? I'm looking at this and it seems like it's very useful data. Do we have any kind of feedback on how much this data actually gets used?
So we have utilization largely from administrative level staff in the pilot. It was sort of a working pilot, build the data up, get feedback, create that process. So it has largely been used by instructional strategists, principals, administrative type counselors. Teachers have used it on and off, but haven't really jumped into the pilot because they weren't sure if it was going to stick around. We do have data from the pilot schools, survey data from the pilot schools about their needs regarding data and information about their students that we did assess at the beginning of the pilot and are going to reassess at the end of the school year to see if they've had any shifts in their ability to counter some of the problems they pointed out with their access to data.
Thank you very much for answering those questions.
Sure.
Are there, as a result of the program and implementing the program full-time, will there be an increase in staffing, personnel?
No.
Or decrease?
No. So
Actually, Mr. Angel, this is going to really fill the void when we remove the data analysts from several schools, or the schools could no longer afford them with their Title I funds. This really will fill the void that other staff members, teachers, instructional strategists have picked up to do in place of that person. In essence, some schools may want to look at their Title I budgets and decide whether the data liaisons, as they're called now, is really a necessity or not.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm ready to go back to the previous question on 1309, the Transportation Cost Center. The increase or baseline budget adjustments of 571. I'll go over the two largest line items first. If you recall, in this column, the changes in retirement rates are reflected, and that's a $235,000 increase for our bus drivers. This is LSCRS. The rates are a little bit higher than that of TRSL. There's also $184,000 that has been included for that 3% premium increase for group health. There were several other amounts, but none that are material as compared to these two. These two line items make up most of that balance.
I'm sorry, which two? I apologize, Mr. Guidry. I was
LSCRS retirement. It's labeled as SERS.
Oh, okay. So
it's almost 235,000, and then the group health line item for 184,000. If you're looking at the detail, it is object on page 40. It's object code 721003.
So the shift from 711701 to 711702 basically more or less cancels each other out. Does this mean we have more board drivers now? Like we're seeing a shift from contract drivers to board drivers?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions with regards to Series 1300? We'll move on to Agenda Item 2.7, General Fund Cost Center's proposed budget for the 1400 series. Ask if there are any questions with regards to the 1400 series. Here, like the
And Mr. Guidry, there seem to be no questions. You want to move on?
Sure. Agenda Item 2.8, General Fund Cost Center's proposed budget for the 1500 series. Are there any questions with regards to the 1500 series?
All right, and is there any public comment on the 12, 13, or 14, or 1500 series? All right, Mr. Guidry.
Okay, this completes, well, let me just point out that on page 11, if we get there, Ms. Richard, scenario 1, the general fund budget summary. This generates or ends up with a budgeted deficit of 3.1 million, which we recommend utilization of an unassigned fund balance, meaning that portion over and above the 3 months that we've set aside for the Economic Stabilization Fund. in order to balance this scenario of the budget that's being proposed. We can, if there are no questions, we can move on to scenario 2. Yes, sir.
Mr. Rangel?
Let's stay on this one. I just want to make sure I understand. This preliminary budget is $3 million over what our revenues are,
Yes, sir.
and you're recommending that we take $3 million from the reserve to make it balance.
That would be the way this one would balance. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Mr. Guidry, how much more than the 3-month reserve do we have in this fund?
Well, if right now our fund balance that we're starting with, because that's the only audited one that we have, right, is the one that was audited as of June 30, 2016. That number was $9,493,230. So we have to estimate what's going to happen this year to see if any of that amount is going to need to be used before we can determine how much is available for 17-18. So in doing that, based on our projections, we feel that there would be an adequate amount remaining from that 9.4 million to cover the 3.1, so that we would not have to utilize any of the economic stabilization funds. That's our projection.
And just help remind me, what is the figure, what is the general figure we use for the 3-month amount?
Well, keep in mind that each year that number changes.
I know, but just generally.
So if let's just say we went with this scenario, just for discussion purposes.
Yeah.
That number would be right at $69.7 million.
Okay. And we're over that
We would be over that, yes.
right now by 9 million?
Well,
I know,
we'd
it's-
be over by at least 3 million by the time we reach 17-18. Yeah.
Okay, you want to talk about scenario 2?
Yes. If there are no objections from the board, what I'd like to do is just review that part of scenario 2 that differs from scenario 1.
Yes, please.
So, Ms. Richard, if you could take us to the third section where we list the adjustments that are not in the cost centers. Yes, ma'am. Okay. I believe this is page 3 of that scenario. More specifically, we'll move the cursor to the very last line, and that is the starting point or the first difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. Right underneath the staffing appeals for plus 15 teachers. You'll notice a line item, principal salary increase to move towards regional average, $166,469. This is the first item included in scenario 2 that is not in 1, and this is an increase. And there's a schedule 4 that's provided that includes a letter from the superintendent, which basically provides the framework or the discussion of the process or this particular review. It also includes the calculations for all of our elementary, middle, and high school principals, as well as the salary information for the school districts that we used in making the comparison and in arriving at the calculated increase that was needed to move us closer to the average of those school districts.
Ms. Morris, do you mind if I maybe just shed some light on why this recommendation is in scenario 2? Members of the board, we are having difficulty recruiting a sufficient reserve of applicants for principal positions. Just recently, we are discovering that our people are leaving Lafayette Parish largely to take better paying jobs. We're also having trouble getting people from out of district to apply in Lafayette Parish. I asked the Human Resource Department to survey 20 school districts in our area of the state, and as I expected, our principal salaries are woefully below the average. We looked not at the contract year, but we looked at the daily rate of pay, and we discovered that our elementary principals are earning $4,000 per year less than the average in those 20 school districts. The middle school principals are earning $5,000 less annually than those 20 school districts. And the high school principals, alarmingly, are $9,000 under the average in those 20 school districts. The cost to bring our principals up to the average was twice the recommendation you see today. It was about $388,000. We're asking the board to consider closing the gap by 50%. And so we think that's going to help. Ideally, we will begin to have a stronger group of people applying for principal positions. I know these are always difficult decisions in the budget, but this speaks to the instructional leadership of a school. And if we're going to ask schools to raise their academic performance, increase the rigor, and have greater success, we need the strongest instructional leaders. So of the things that are in the budget, I urge you to give serious consideration to finding a way to help improve the salaries for our principals. Thank you.
Dr. Aguilar, I'm going to pick on you a little bit. If it were me, and I was making that survey, I'd survey the highest 20 parishes in Louisiana to make sure that they're going to be higher than us. And I'm not accusing you of doing it. I'm just saying that's what I would do. Is St. Tammany in one of your 20 parishes?
They are.
What about St. Landry?
St. Landry's in.
Okay, thanks.
So's Evangeline, Avoyelles, Assumption. So we surveyed 20 of our surrounding neighbors.
Dr. Aguilar. Couple things. I agree with you. In fact, I'm aware of a middle school principal in our parish who came from another parish, a neighboring parish, who's making $10,000 less than they were making in our neighboring parishes. I've seen groups of folks who, at budget time, of course, when it's a competition, talk about how our administrators are paid well enough, but I'm also aware of teachers on campuses who make as much or more of their principal than their principal do. So I'm in support of this measure just for what you said. It's you only get the best of the best if you pay for it, and I want the best of the best. So I'm with you.
I would just mention briefly what's striking is that since January we've lost 3 Lafayette Parish School administrators to the diocese, which is rather unusual. That it's historically it's always been felt that Lafayette public schools are going to pay more than the diocese, and we are losing good people to the diocese.
Okay, the next line item is the removal of those 4 assistant principal slots that were over and above the staffing ratio. So that is an actual decrease to expenditures, followed by a reduction in the number of instructional strategists due to a change from a 1-to-1 ratio for A and B schools. In other words, 1 instructional strategist for each A and B school, to a 1-to-2 ratio, where there would be one instructional strategist for 2 schools. A and B schools would actually share instructional strategists, which would result in a reduction of 11 positions and with an estimated savings of $880,000. The next line item is elimination of the step
Mr.
increase.
Guidry, Mr. Hidalgo has a question.
I guess it's more of a statement. Do we want to wait till we're all done, or as we go? Okay. So while I agree 100% on the principals scenario we just talked about, I disagree 100% on this scenario. Those same principals who we entrust in to deliver that quality education through their leadership on campus, and many, many, many teachers I've talked to, say the one thing that they don't want to lose are their support in the instructional strategists. Not only that, but, and I don't have a better word, so for lack of a better term, we're targeting A and B schools. Well, listen, we've already got the pupil-teacher ratio lower at D and F schools, okay? So, which means the pupil-teacher ratio is higher at A and B schools. And then now we're going to attack it even further by getting rid of another imperative resource that they have. I totally disagree with this. I hope that we can pull this out, not even consider this, okay? I don't think, and you may all not look at it this way, but I don't think we need to further punish the A and B schools for doing well. I'm fortunate enough to have A and B schools all across the district I represent, and I don't think they need to be further punished. So I'm hoping that you can reconsider this.
The last line item or last difference is basically elimination of the step increase for fiscal year 17-18 for all full-time employees. Estimated savings $2 million. And those changes bring us to the projected deficit or budgeted deficit. I'm sorry, actually it brings us to a surplus of $67,148. There would be no need for utilization of fund balance in this scenario. And that's basically it in terms of the differences between the two scenarios.
All right, any public comment on scenario 2?
Jennifer Gardner, principal of Alamo. I am an A school, Mr. Hidalgo, and we became an A the first year we actually had our instructional strategists put into place. They are the backbone of our school also. I'm going to say some things that I heard today. We had a wonderful professional development conference this morning off campus. One instructional strategist felt like she's at a C school, so she gets to keep her job, and her job is to help that school grow, right, to a B or an A. Yet once she gets to a B school, her job will now be in jeopardy. My instructional strategist is the backbone. I mean, we are the support, and she makes sure instruction happens in that classroom. We spoke to principals. I can't imagine trying to share, and I do understand the budget crisis, but losing that to provide the continuing instruction, I just don't see how we're going to continue to move forward. We do, at an A and a B school, have a higher student ratio than the lower schools, but we also provide the balance in the report card. So if I start to drop, or if I don't have an A, the average to help the D and the F doesn't allow the B average in the district. So to continue to pull back from because we are doing well doesn't seem fair across the board either. So, I mean, I could go on and we could line them all up, but they are an invaluable asset to our district. And the central office sees them as they provide support not only to us as administrators, but for our administrative conference, they include them into all that. So they are provided, and some of our instructional strategists are those next assistant principals, and they've been provided the instructional leadership for the next level. So when they get there to be the the assistant principal and principal, they're going to continue to grow our schools.
Sam, I have a question. Do you have any suggestion for those of us who believe in a balanced budget as to where else cuts might be made in your case?
I do, and I've expressed them, and I really prefer not to say it at the microphone because I don't have a target on my back. But I do, and I believe some has to do.
I'm not going to ask you to say
that's fine, but I do, and I've suggested them before, and it's a lot of work. But here we are with the balance, trying to balance the budget. Anything in the long run that's going to be great or needs to be changed involves work. So I do, but I also think that this is a needed item for continued growth that we've worked so hard in our district.
I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe somebody up there can tell me, but I would say, Dr. Aguilar, 75-85% of our budget is salaries.
I would say it's higher than that.
90%. So obviously that would probably be the place, from which to take. I mean, from which to cut.
Cut portions, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And Ms. Morris, if you don't mind, I want to be clear that we generated scenario 2 after the failed tax proposition, and we did this very quickly. The scenario 1, we have been working on that scenario for the past 10 weeks, building it slowly. It was essentially a standstill budget. Scenario 2 was reality, that we want to get back to presenting the board a balanced budget. So we made those recommendations very quickly. So in the case of 11 instructional strategists, I want to be clear, that's not necessarily my preference. It represents $880,000. We would need to decide where to find $880,000 in our budget to keep those 11 positions. Likewise, foregoing the step increase is a significant event for all of our employees, but that represents about $3 million in the budget difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. So I'm committed to, if we want to maintain instructional strategists, then we still have to find $880,000 of savings in the budget.
Dr. Aguilar, in scenario 1 we found $3 million in the reserve fund, right? And so in this case it would be $880,000, but to your point, Mr. Angel, and you said this some time back, we have to come up with a balanced budget. We know that, but we also have to try to keep what we know and what we're being told by the professionals is important to the district for the kids' sake. And so if it means step increases versus important positions that boots on the ground every day, that's one of those tough decisions. If it means the reserve fund, which it's a reoccurring expense, that's another one of those tough decisions. But I can tell you that I am not in support of losing. Everybody's important, but guess what? You have to have certain things, right, in the school to operate. And what I'm being told is they need their instructional strategists. I'm not in the classroom. I'm not speaking from experience, but I can tell you what I've heard a few times. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. I want to speak up on behalf of the children in Lafayette Parish. Providing high-quality curriculum and instructional supports is the right thing to do for our children to obtain the highest academic success. This is achieved by equipping our schools with high-quality instructional human resources, such as our instructional strategists. An instructional strategist is a curriculum coordinator, an SBLC coordinator, the RTI specialist, a data analyst, and a classroom teacher mentor. This person guides teachers to focus on the Louisiana student standards and the identified power standards, curriculum maps to guide instruction, and to review student data to align appropriate interventions for improving student achievement. We developed our Vision 2020 as a strategic academic plan. We focused on best practices to move forwards to achieve our goals. We raised accountability scores in 1 year, more than doubled the 2.5 SPS points as our goal. That kind of growth will not occur every year, but we cannot take away the supports that are moving us forward and still expect positive results. So I thank you for hearing me, and that's on behalf of the children. They deserve to have all the supports they can in the schools.
All right, I do think that before we conclude this meeting, we need to give some direction to our staff. And with that said, with the failure of the sales tax proposal, I think that we also need to consider our facilities issues and to make those cuts necessary so that we can still move forward with addressing those facility needs that we've identified. I don't think we can just sweep them under the rug because the sales tax proposal failed. So I think that while we're going through this budget process, we need to keep in mind the things that Ms. Samick just talked about, as well as those facility needs. And of course, addressing those facility needs will be much slower without the sales tax being passed. But I think that it is important for us to continue working toward that goal as well. Mr. Santani.
Mr. Gidger, I have a big picture question here. I'm looking at scenario 2. I'm all the way down. Where is it? I'm down on page 12, where it says total expenditures $271,307,201. And then we have a baseline budget adjustment. So the budgeted surplus deficit, right below it says $7.8 million. And that would, a reasonable person, I think, would infer that our prior year budget was out of balance by $7.8 million. Or alternatively, that we use $7.8 million of fund balance to balance our budget.
That's one way of looking at it, but one thing to keep in mind is we haven't, in this column, we haven't made any of the revisions to our revenues that we're going to make at year end.
I understand.
So
we recognized $263 million in change last year in revenues, and we budgeted $271 million of expenditures.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the 263 will probably won't be that far off from the 271 by the time the year is over with, if our sales tax collections continue. I just wanted to make that clear. That's based on the revenues as we have them budgeted, as opposed to the revenues that we will actually collect.
Okay. Well, here's my proposal. My proposal is that we reduce our expected revenues in the top forward of the budget to be $271 million, and recognize that budgeting an increase in sales tax revenues when we had a banner year, it only decreased 1% instead of 7. But budgeting an increase, and I get that we're budgeting an increase of the decrease, so that it is actually still a decrease from 2 years ago, but including that $2.955 million in the 1965 tax, in the 1988 tax, and then in the property tax, and I get that property taxes are also very likely to rise this year. But what we probably should do is we should probably reduce these increases in expenditures or in revenues, and go ahead and wait until we get to the end of the year and say, okay, now we have extra money that we didn't anticipate having. Let's make a decision about what's the best thing to do with it. Because to Ms. Morris's point, every employee we have is important. I'm sure everybody's job is important and valuable, but at some point we got to build some buildings. At some point, and if we can't even set aside increases in revenue when they happen, then we're never going to get out of this hole. So I don't know how you want to go about, if there's a motion or something, but I would provide direction. Because at the end of it all, one more comment about this, I'm uncomfortable going into, and I'm speaking to the administrators and the teachers now, I'm uncomfortable going into the line items of the budget and saying, here's where I think money needs to be cut. I would much rather give the superintendent a number to hit so that he can go and conference with you guys and try to find out what works at each individual school, because I know A and B schools, D and F schools, principals are different, strategists get used different ways. Probably at some school in the district, they'd rather have an assistant principal than an instructional strategist, or maybe they'd rather have 2 instructional strategists than an assistant principal. I mean, I think we ought to, Dr. Aguilar, if there's anything that we can do to ease that process for you, if to provide you some flexibility in how you assign employees, you know, I'd love to help out. But I want to give the number to you guys and say, here's our priorities, here's the money we have, here's the money we're willing to budget. Let's go ahead and try to be as effective as possible while still keeping in mind that we do have to provide structures. Everybody knows these buildings aren't adequate. They're not. But at the same time, we can't go from a $271 million general fund budget to a $278 million general fund budget and not build a single thing. We can't do that. So I would propose, however you want that to happen, Ms. Morris.
All right, before we continue with that, Ms. Saunier wanted to make a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank you for asking for all the input from people as you went through this budget. This is the first time a lot of people have seen the budget, and I think we would like to take some time, and the teachers, you know, out in the system that may be watching it on TV, to reflect what's in the budget and what they feel they may need to cut, you know, to save some money. Because teachers can be very creative, you know, if you just give them an opportunity to voice their opinions. And I think, you know, the direction that you want to give, Mrs. Centini, to the superintendent is a good direction to go into, because we will have to cut. And I will tell you that in '80, when we had to cut, we cut all conferences for 2 years. Nobody went to a conference from the central office. If you had to go, you had to beg on your knees to the superintendent, and he only gave you like half the cost. You had to pay for the rest. And it's things like that. It may be nickel and diming it, but it shows that you're trying to save some money. So let them come up with things to give to you and suggestions they can make to the board, because there are ways we can save some of this money, because the schools, you know, some of those Butler buildings need to be repaired, and we need to build schools. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saunier. Now back to your point, Mr. Centani, this was noticed as a special meeting, and we do have a quorum here, so I think that we would be well within our rules to make a formal motion for directives. If you have your motion worded.
Madam President, I move that we, Mr. Guidry, after I make this motion, please tell me if this is not what you need from me, okay? I move that we reduce the increase, and let me point out that I'm referring to scenario 2 in all of these. Reduce the increase to sales tax revenue to 0. Reduce the increase to 1988 sales tax revenue to 0. Reduce the increase to property taxes to 0. And can somebody add that? I guess I can. Can somebody add? Tell me what that sums up to. 1, 2, 5, 5, 9, 3, 6.
We've got all our accountants here adding it.
All right, so that's $7.579 million. Does that give me to 271? Certainly, that gets me there, right?
Yes. Well, we get a second before we discuss it.
Yes.
Second it.
We just need to keep in mind that in addition to this, we have some line items that are not going to be able to be cut. More specifically, the retirement contributions. That's probably about $1.2 million. Group health, I would think something will be done, although that's just my opinion. There's further discussion before the board makes their decision. Right now, if the 3% were approved, That's about $1.3 million. And then there are the salary increase, putting in the full impact of that. There's a change, the adjusting to the current salaries to reflect the current staffing. So you're probably looking at an additional $4 million by the time you sum total all of that, the increase in the ECA tuition, those sorts of things, where the $500,000 for utilities at Southside. So in addition to that $7 million, you'll probably be adding, $4 to $5 million for those expenditures that have been added that we really, it's not an option. We're going to have to add them. So I just want to make that as a point before y'all decide what y'all want to do.
Mr. Santani, I don't know if your motion's complete, but you're not moving that we adopt scenario 2. Rather, you are working towards a motion to give a revenue amount to staff to work with and to bring cuts back to us that meet that.
That is correct. I mean, I guess I'm implying scenario 2 because this goes $7.5 million beyond
right
scenario 2 contemplated. So it's a number that the sales tax revenue, the property tax revenue, or the local revenue numbers were the same in both scenarios. So I guess all I'm asking is for them to take that number back and speak with, have the superintendent speak with staff and speak with Mr. Guidry's office and figure out how they can do their best to hit that total revenue number.
Okay, so you're backing out the expected increase in sales tax revenue, the 1988 sales tax and property tax from the total of $278 million.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and you're asking staff to bring us a balanced budget within that reduced number.
That is correct.
Okay. Do you want to reword your motion?
Madam President, I move that we reduce the sales tax revenue line. The sales tax revenue increased to 0. The 1988 sales tax increased to 0. The property tax increased to 0. And direct staff to bring a balanced budget using that total revenue number.
Okay. Mr. Angel,
Is that sufficient, Mr. Guidry? Is that a sufficient motion? Thank you.
Can you tell Ms. Melva?
So, members of the board, just to be clear so that the members in the audience understand the challenge, the opportunity, we're being asked to literally begin with scenario 2, which is balanced, and then cut an additional $7.5 million out of the budget.
Well, and I think I want to clarify that we're not.
Scenario 2 is balanced. So
I don't think that we are making any determinations from the board perspective on the instructional strategist, the step increase.
I didn't hear that, but scenario 2 is balanced. And to get down to $271 million is an additional $7.5 million.
All right. Any questions or comments from the public on the motion? Ms. Espinoza?
Kathleen Espinoza. Just a couple of points for clarification. It seems like you have two different motions here. You want to adjust what Mr. Guidry has presented by a number, and then you want to direct staff. Am I correct?
It may be that the motion's not worded very well.
Well, it just seems like there should be two separate motions. I mean, just in the interest. And then to the second point, there's a long process, right, that follows this particular meeting, and I guess I'm a little bit concerned that this particular motion, the second half of that motion, might limit public input. I don't know. That's just
we were going to do our best to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Dr. Aguilar, with the motion that's on the floor, do you feel confident that you can bring something to us back by Thursday? Thursday is our next budget meeting that's already on the schedule, so I'm asking Dr. Aguilar where he thinks he might be by then.
No, I don't think so. Don't we have a meeting next week?
Next
A budget
Tues-
workshop?
Yes, next Tuesday.
Tuesday might work. Now, I want to be clear. I will bring you a list of recommendations. Ultimately, you may have to pick and choose.
Okay. All right. Any other public comment? All right. Any questions or comments from the board? Everyone understands the motion? All right. All right, Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote.
Seven for, none against.
All right, that concludes our meeting. Good night.